The dining table was set for 10 when I got to my father's door on Christmas Eve. I could see it through the front window. The long table my mother used to decorate, dressed in someone else's taste now, gold chargers and white candles, and a centerpiece that looked like it came with an invoice. I counted the place settings out of habit, the way you count stairs in the dark. 10 plates, 10 chairs. There were 12 people in our family if you counted everyone who had sat at that table every Christmas for the last 19 years. The 2 missing chairs belonged to me and to my grandfather. It was Vanessa who answered the door, my father's wife of 2 years, in a red dress and a smile she'd had time to prepare, holding the door the way you hold a door when the house behind you is yours now. She said the thing she had clearly rehearsed, that they had decided to keep it small this year, just close family and a few friends, and that she was sure I understood. Close family? I was 22 years old and I was standing on the porch of the house I grew up in, hearing my father's wife explain that I wasn't close family. Somewhere behind her I heard his voice, asking who was at the door, and I heard her answer, "Nobody, honey, it's nothing. Nobody, it's nothing." 6 weeks later, my grandfather sat down across from his lawyer and did something that took most of the morning and was worth $752 million. My father wasn't consulted, and Vanessa, the woman who decided who counted as family at that table, wasn't in the room when she lost. This is the story of how a man who built everything by reading people read one person exactly right. If you're new here, please subscribe. It helps the channel grow and reach more people. Now let's get started. I want to be precise about what this story is and what it isn't, because the title might suggest something simpler than the truth. This is not a revenge story. Nobody in this story sets a trap, fakes evidence, or stands up at a wedding with a folder of printouts. What happened to my father happened in plain daylight, with lawyers present, with every word spoken calmly. And he walked into all of it himself, one decision at a time, holding the hand of the woman who was walking him there. This is a story about my grandfather, Raymond Hale, a man who spent 50 years making one bet over and over, that he could look at a person and see what they were going to do before they knew it themselves. He bet his company on it. He bet his fortune on it. And in the winter I'm going to tell you about, he bet his family on it. I need you to hold one question while I tell this story, because it's the question I held for years. When the person who reads everyone says, "Your father is going to lose everything," and then hands you 40% of his life's work to make sure something survives, what exactly did he see in you? I know the answer now. It took me a long time to be able to say it out loud, to understand that Christmas Eve, you have to understand 3 people: my grandfather, my father, and Vanessa. My grandfather first, because everything starts with him. Raymond Hale poured foundations for other men's companies until he was 24 years old. Then he borrowed $11,000 against a truck he'd already paid off twice in repairs, and he started bidding on the jobs nobody wanted. The awkward lots, the renovations other contractors walked away from, the work that was all problem and no prestige. 50 years later, Hale Construction Group employed over 4,000 people across 9 states, and the last private valuation, the one that made the trade journals, put the company at $752 million. People who wrote about him always got the story slightly wrong. They wrote about work ethic, about timing, about the housing booms he rode. My grandfather never corrected them, because the real answer sounded like bragging and he didn't brag. But he told me once, in the office at the back of his house, what the actual skill was. "Concrete doesn't lie to you," he said. "Steel doesn't lie to you. The numbers don't lie to you. Only people lie to you. So the whole job, the entire job, Sarah, is figuring out which people aren't lying." He was famous for it inside the company. He hired a site foreman in 1989 that every other contractor in Columbus had passed over because the man had a record from when he was 19. That foreman ran half the group's field operations by the time he retired and never cost my grandfather $1 he didn't earn back tenfold. In 1996, my grandfather walked away from a partnership with a developer everyone loved. Charming man, perfect handshake, remembered everyone's birthdays. My grandfather sat through one dinner with him and declined the deal the next morning. 4 years later, that man went to prison for fraud, and he took 2 of my grandfather's competitors down with him. People asked him how he knew. He always gave the same answer, and for most of my life I thought it was a joke. I watch what people do when they think the test is over. My grandmother Ruth died 6 years before that Christmas, and after she was gone, the family tradition got, if anything, more sacred. Every Christmas Eve, everyone came to my parents' house. My grandfather, my Aunt Carol and her husband and their 2 kids, the cousins, the same dishes, the same argument about whether the turkey was better than last year. 19 years without a single break. Through my grandmother's death. Through everything. Through my mother's death, too. My mother died of ovarian cancer when I was 15. She was diagnosed in March and she was gone by November. And I'm not going to take you through that year because it isn't this story. But you need to know 2 things about it. The first is that my father did not handle it. Some men grieve and some men flee. And my father found a third option, which was to become very busy and very agreeable and very absent while standing right in front of you. The second is that my grandfather drove to our house every Sunday that whole year. He didn't bring advice. He brought groceries, and he sat with me at the kitchen table while I did homework, and when I asked him once why he kept coming when Dad barely came out of his office, he looked at me for a moment. "Because grief shows you what a person is made of," he said, "and I want you to have somebody made of something." Even then, even about his own son, he'd already read the file. My father met Vanessa when I was 19, 4 years after Mom died. And I want to be fair here, because fairness matters in this story more than almost anywhere. Nobody begrudged him meeting someone. Not me, not Aunt Carol, not my grandfather. Loneliness had hollowed him out, and when he started smiling again, we were glad. And Vanessa, in the beginning, was extraordinary. I mean that as a professional assessment, the way you'd describe a gifted athlete. She remembered everything I ever told her. She asked about my exams by name, not how's school, but how did the structure's midterm go, the one you were worried about. She brought my grandfather books about the history of American infrastructure and listened to his stories with her chin on her hand like he was the most interesting man alive. At dinners, she laughed a half second after my father's jokes, every time, like a metronome of delight. I was 20 and I thought she was wonderful. My grandfather sat through one dinner with her, her first family Christmas, the year before the wedding, and said almost nothing all night. I remember being annoyed with him for it. I thought he was being cold to her. On the drive home, he'd asked me to ride with him, which he did when he wanted to talk. He was quiet for a long while, and then he asked me a strange question. "Did you see what she did when the Hendersons' boy spilled the wine?" A friend's son, 11 years old, had knocked a glass of red over the tablecloth near the end of dinner. A small chaos. Napkins, apologies. My father laughing it off. "She helped clean it up," I said. "She looked first," my grandfather said, "before she moved. She looked at your father to see what he wanted her to do. Then she did it." He drove in silence for a moment. Everything that woman does goes through that checkpoint. Every single thing, all night. Watch for it. I told him he was being unfair. I told him she was just attentive, that new people in a family try hard, that he of all people should give someone credit for paying attention. He didn't argue. That was the thing about my grandfather. He never argued about a read. He just put it on the table and let time do the arguing. "I hope you're right," he said. "I'd rather be wrong than right about this one." They married 8 months later, and the woman who came back from that honeymoon was somebody I had never met. It didn't happen all at once. It happened the way water damage happens, invisibly behind the walls, and by the time you see the stain, the structure is already soft. The Sunday dinners at my father's house stopped first. There was always a reason. Renovations, travel. Vanessa wasn't feeling well. And the reasons were always reasonable. And after 8 or 9 reasonable reasons, the dinners simply didn't exist anymore, and nobody could point to the day they died. Then my calls started going differently. I'd call my father's phone. Vanessa would answer it. "He's in the shower, he's just stepped out, he's exhausted. Can I take a message?" The messages, I learned later, did not always arrive, or arrived edited. I told Vanessa about my engineering school awards dinner that spring, the one where I won the department structures prize, and asked her to make sure Dad knew the date. She said, "Of course, how wonderful. He'll be so proud." He never came. When I brought it up weeks later, hurt, he looked genuinely confused. He'd been told the dinner was some school thing, and that I'd said attendance from parents was optional and a little embarrassing. That was the day I started to understand what I was dealing with. Not a rude stepmother, not a difficult personality, a translator. Everything between my father and the people who loved him now passed through her, and the translations had an agenda. I tried talking to him about it once carefully in his driveway. He got the look, I'd learned that look well, the tightened, defensive face of a man being asked to choose between an uncomfortable truth and a comfortable life. He said Vanessa adored me. He said she was still finding her place in the family, that it was hard coming in from outside, that everyone needed to give her grace. Grace. We gave her 2 years of grace, and she spent it dismantling 19 years of family, one reasonable explanation at a time. You're probably wondering about the money. So was she. Long before any of us understood that's what was happening. My grandfather was not subtle about his estate in the way rich men are usually not subtle. Everyone knew roughly what existed, and nobody discussed what would happen to it. The group was his. He was 74 and still chairman, still walked sites in a hard hat, still read every major bid. My father was a senior vice president. Commercial development, a real job he did adequately. The assumption, never spoken, was the obvious one. Daniel was the son. Daniel carried the name. Daniel would inherit the company. Vanessa had done that math before the wedding. I'm certain of it now. The way she had courted my grandfather in the beginning, the infrastructure books, the chin on the hand, that wasn't a daughter-in-law seeking affection. That was an investor doing due diligence. And here's the detail that tells you everything about both of them. At some point in that second year, she stopped courting him. She must have decided the inheritance was structural, that it would flow to Daniel by gravity, by name, by the simple fact of being the son, and that the old man himself no longer needed managing. The book stopped. The attentive questions stopped. At the last family gathering before that Christmas, she sat next to my grandfather for 2 hours and spoke to him twice. She stopped performing for him because she thought the test was over. He was watching exactly for that. He'd told me so years before, and I'd thought it was a joke. Then came Christmas. The phone call from my father came on December 19th. To me, at least he made the call himself. I'll give him that much. The words were Vanessa's. I could hear the construction of them, keeping it small this year, a different kind of celebration, hosting some of Vanessa's circle. We'll do something in January, just us. What about Grandpa? I asked. A pause. Dad will understand. He's not much for parties these days anyway. He's not much for parties. His own father. 19 consecutive Christmas Eves, and Raymond Hale was getting bumped from the guest list of his own family's table, in a house, I'll add, that Hale construction money had paid for, to make room for Vanessa's circle. I drove to the house on Christmas Eve anyway. I'm not entirely sure why. Some part of me needed to see it with my own eyes, needed to not be managed through a phone line. That's how I ended up on that porch, counting 10 plates through the window, listening to Vanessa tell my father I was nobody, and it was nothing. I stood in the cold for a moment after she shut the door. Then I got in my car and drove to my grandfather's house. He opened the door before I knocked. He'd heard the car. Or, knowing him, He'd been expecting me since December 19th. He looked at my face, and I watched him read the whole evening off it in about 2 seconds. The drive over, the window, the plates, the door. He didn't make me say any of it. "I've got a turkey that's too big for one man," he said, "and your aunt's bringing the kids at 7. Get in here before the heat gets out." That Christmas Eve at my grandfather's house is one of the best nights of my life. I need you to understand that because everything that came after grew out of it. It wasn't a sad refuge for the 2 exiles. The house filled up. Aunt Carol arrived with my Uncle Mark and the kids, my cousins, and Carol, who had clearly heard everything already, hugged me about 4 seconds longer than usual and said exactly 1 sentence about it. Their loss, and one day it'll have a number on it. I thought she was just being auntish. It would turn out she was being prophetic. The turkey was overcooked and nobody cared. The kids destroyed the living room with a board game. And late in the evening, the conversation found its way to the company. Carol ran the group's civil division. She'd been with the firm her whole career. And then, gradually, the table thinned out until it was my grandfather and me with coffee, and he started asking me questions. Real questions. Not grandfather questions. Chairman questions. What did I think of the new airport concourse design they'd bid on? Why did I think the prefabrication trend was changing mid-rise economics? What would I do about the labor pipeline problem, the way the trades were aging out faster than they were filling in? I was a senior in civil engineering at Ohio State. I'd grown up around this company the way farm kids grow up around weather. And I answered him honestly, including the 2 times I told him I thought the group was wrong about something. The second time I said it, it was about their bidding posture on public infrastructure. I thought they were leaving an entire category of work on the table out of old habit. He put his coffee down and looked at me for a long moment, and there was something in his face I didn't have a name for that night. "Who taught you to think like that?" he asked. "You did, mostly by arguing with you." He laughed, the real laugh, the rare one. And then he said something I didn't understand until later. "You know what your father would have said just now? He would have agreed with me. Before he even knew what I thought, he'd have agreed with me." He turned his cup slowly on the table. "You checked the numbers, and then you didn't care what I thought. There's no putting that in a person, Sarah. It's either in them or it isn't." I drove home after midnight. I learned long afterward, from Carol, who heard it from the lawyer's side of things, that my grandfather was up until 3 in the morning that night, alone in his office with a legal pad. Whatever he wrote on that pad, here is what I believe was on his mind. I pieced it together over the years, from things he said later, and I'd bet the company on the accuracy of it. He had watched his son get hollowed out twice, once by grief, once by a woman who had studied the hollow and moved in. He had watched Vanessa perform for him and then watched her stop performing, and he knew to the week when she'd stopped, and he knew what it meant. She had already mentally banked the inheritance. He had sat at enough negotiating tables to know what happens next in that story. Daniel inherits the group. Vanessa, within a few years, is the group. Through him, around him, the translator becoming the signatory. And a thing he had spent 50 years building, 4,000 families' worth of livelihoods, gets carried off one reasonable explanation at a time by a woman whose every action went through a checkpoint. And on the other side of the ledger, his daughter Carol, 26 years inside the company, twice passed over in the industry's imagination because the assumption only ever had Daniel's name on it. And a 22-year-old granddaughter who checked the numbers and then didn't care what the chairman thought. He always said the whole job was figuring out which people weren't lying. In the second week of February, 6 weeks after that Christmas, his lawyer, Howard Bishop, cleared his morning calendar. My grandfather did not believe in wills. That's not quite right. He had one, meticulous, updated. What he didn't believe in was the theater of wills. The family in dark clothes, the lawyer's conference room, the dead man speaking through paper, everyone discovering at the worst possible moment what the patriarch really thought of them. He'd seen it gut 3 families he did business with. A will is a report card you hand out after the school burns down, he told me once. Useless to everybody. So he didn't wait to die. That was the move, and I want you to sit with how unusual it is, because everything that happened after flows from it. He decided to divide the estate while he was alive, restructure the ownership of Hale Construction Group and the family holdings, transfer it, all of it, with himself remaining as chairman of the board during a transition period, but with the equity gone out of his hands. Why? He gave the official reasons to the lawyers: tax architecture, succession stability, orderly transition, all true and all secondary. The real reason, he told me on a job site 2 years later, watching a crew pour a foundation. Anyone can behave in front of a will, Sarah. A will is a test people can see coming. I wanted to see what everyone did when the money was real and I was still here to watch. He wanted to run the experiment live. The man watched what people did when they thought the test was over, and so he built a test that started exactly where every other test ends. The family was called to Bishop's office on a Tuesday morning in late February. Everyone came. My father and Vanessa, her in a camel coat doing warm hellos around the room, working it like a cocktail hour. Carol and Mark. Me, confused about why I was even on the list. I assumed I'd been included as a courtesy, that this was some procedural thing about trusts. Bishop read the structure plainly. He was a man built for plainness, and I have replayed his voice in my head many times. 50% of the family's equity in Hale Construction Group and its holding entities. To Carol Hale Bennett, effective on signature, with Carol assuming the role of chief executive within 18 months. 40% to Sarah Hale, me, held in a structured trust until I turned 25, with board observation rights immediately and a development plan through the company's operations divisions. My grandfather had personally written the rotation, site work first, because nobody should sign a change order who hasn't stood in the mud the order changes. 10% to Daniel Hale. There's a quality of silence that I had only read about before that morning. The silence of a room where one person's entire imagined future is being deleted line by line in real time, while etiquette holds everyone's bodies in place. I watched my father's face go through it. Confusion, then reconfusion, as if he'd misheard a number. Then the long, falling realization that he hadn't. Then I watched him do the thing that told the whole story of his life. He looked at Vanessa, not at his father, not at the man who'd just handed him roughly $75 million worth of equity. Because that's the absurd thing. 10% of that company was still a fortune, more than almost anyone alive will ever touch. He looked at his wife, to see how he was supposed to feel about it. The checkpoint ran in both directions now. My grandfather saw it too. He told me later it was the saddest thing in the room that day, and the most confirming. Vanessa's face did something I will never forget, mostly because of how little it did. The warmth didn't drain out of it. It switched off like a sign in a shop window at closing time. She looked at Bishop. Then she looked at my grandfather, and for the first time in 3 years, the performance was completely gone, and what was behind it looked at him directly. He looked back. I think it was the most honest moment the two of them ever shared, both of them finally meeting without costumes. My father found his voice eventually. It came out wounded, then loud. What was this? What had he done to deserve? He was the one who'd given his career to the company. Was this about Christmas? Was this a punishment? Had Carol orchestrated it? Had I? That one stung. I'll be honest. He turned on me, 22 years old in a chair I hadn't asked to sit in, and demanded to know what I'd said to Grandpa. My grandfather let him finish. The whole flood. He'd built half a century of negotiations on letting the other side empty themselves first. Then he said calmly, "The sentence I open this story promising you, and I am quoting it exactly, because every word was placed like a brick. I'm not punishing you, son. I'm protecting you the only way I have left." My father said that didn't make any sense. "I know it doesn't," my grandfather said. Ask me again in 5 years." Vanessa stood up at that point and walked out, measured, unhurried, coat over her arm. She had nothing to gain in that room anymore, so the room stopped existing. If anyone needed a final exhibit for the case, Raymond Hale had been quietly assembling for 3 years. It was the sound of those heels in the hallway, departing at the exact moment the money did. My father followed her. He paused at the door. He looked back at his father, and there was a boy's face inside the 50-year-old man's face for a second, and I genuinely believe some part of him was asking to be talked out of leaving. My grandfather met his eyes and said nothing. Reads aren't rescues. He knew the difference better than anyone, and that morning I watched what the difference costs. The door closed. Bishop shuffled the papers. Carol let out a breath, and my grandfather turned to me, and what he said next was the actual beginning of my adult life. "You'll want to know why," he said. "Carol's share you can understand. She's earned it 3 times over and been invisible the whole time, which is my failure as much as anyone's. But you, 40%, and you're 22, and there are men on my board who will call it sentiment by lunchtime." He leaned forward. "It is not sentiment. I have hired 4,000 people, Sarah. I have read every kind of person there is to read. You are studious in a family that coasts. You are curious in a family that assumes. And you take real risks and check real numbers, which is the rarest combination there is. Most people only ever manage one." He tapped the table once, softly. "I'm not giving you 40% because you're my granddaughter. I'm giving it to you because if you walked into my office as a stranger, I'd hire you on the spot. And because I'm 74, and this is the last big bid I'm ever going to place. I bid on people my whole life. You're the bid." I didn't say anything for a while. There wasn't anything in me old enough to answer with. "What if you're wrong?" I finally managed. He smiled and stood up and put on his coat. "I'm not," he said, "but that's what the 5 years are for." What followed was the experiment he'd designed, running live, with all of us inside it. And I want to walk you through what those years actually looked like, because this is where his reads stopped being opinions and became results. Carol took over as CEO inside the 18 months. The trade press called it a surprise. Inside the company, it was the opposite. I watched division heads who'd worked beside her for decades visibly relax. She was demanding in the useful way, allergic to flattery, and she knew where every body was buried on every job site in 9 states because she'd usually been the one who found them. The group didn't wobble in the transition. It accelerated. I graduated in the spring and went in the way he'd designed. Boots first. Site engineer on a parking structure in Dayton, where exactly one person knew whose granddaughter I was. The superintendent, who had been told by my grandfather personally that if I got any treatment other than the standard one, the superintendent would be explaining it to him at his kitchen table. I stood in the mud. I made the rookie mistakes in front of people who let me make them. I learned what a change order costs in human hours and bad backs, and the day I caught a load miscalculation in a subcontractor's steel package, sat up at midnight with the numbers because something smelled wrong and was right, the story got back to the old man before I'd even filed the report. Carol told me he carried that one around for weeks, telling it to people who hadn't asked. He stayed chairman, and those years... I have to slow down here, because this is the part of the story that has nothing to do with money. Those years gave me my grandfather in a way nothing else could have. We talked 3-4 times a week. Job sites, his office, his kitchen. He downloaded 50 years into me, not as lectures, but as cases. This partner, that bid, this betrayal, that bet. The pattern under all of it never changed. Watch what people do when they think the test is over. Watch who looks before they move. Watch who checks the numbers and then stops caring what the room thinks. And on the other side of town, the other half of the experiment was running too. My father took his 10%, and 10% of a $752 million enterprise, converted and structured the way his was, meant that he was, by any sane measure, rich for life. A man could do nothing at all and live beautifully forever on what he received. That is the part people miss when they hear this story. My grandfather didn't cut him off. He gave him a fortune, sized precisely, I came to understand, as an instrument, big enough to live on forever, big enough to reveal him completely. The reveal took about 18 months to begin, and then it came in chapters. The house in Dublin was sold for the house in Naples, Gulf front, 9,000 square feet, photographed for a magazine with Vanessa in the foyer. Then the boat, named after her. Then the second boat, because the first, I'm told, had charm issues. There was a winery investment in Oregon brought to them by friends of Vanessa's. It lost money with remarkable efficiency. There was a private aviation membership, then a fractional jet share, because the membership had wait times. There was a development project of his own. He wanted to show his father he could build too. Capitalized confidently, run by charming people Vanessa endorsed, and dead in 3 years with his name on the lawsuits. He called me sometimes in those years. The calls were warm the way a brochure is warm, and every call, somewhere in the middle, arrived at the same junction. How was the group doing? What was Carol up to? Had the board thought about, and here it would come, whether the family structure was really fair, whether Dad shouldn't have a seat, whether Grandpa was being poisoned against him. The word poisoned was Vanessa's. I could always hear the construction. I asked my grandfather once, we were in his truck, I remember, driving back from a site in Marion, whether it hurt to be right, whether he watched Naples and the boats and the lawsuits and felt vindicated. He didn't answer for about a mile. Then, I built this company on reading people, Sarah, and in 50 years I never once enjoyed it. The read is just the truth arriving early. You don't celebrate truth like that. You just get the buildings out of its way. That's the whole man, in 2 sentences. People thought Raymond Hale's gift made him cynical. It was the opposite. He saw everything coming and loved people anyway. He just refused to hand them the tools to ruin what he built. He never spoke one cruel word about my father in all those years. He said only, and he said it more than once, looking out a window, "Your father isn't greedy. He's asleep. She's expensive, but the sleep is what's costing him. One day he'll wake up broke, and the worst part is she'll be gone by then, because waking up is the one thing she was never going to stay for." Hold that sentence. We're almost there. It took 6 years, start to finish. Almost exactly the 5 he'd asked for, plus 1 for the paperwork. The group, under Carol, and eventually, under Carol and me together, when I came off rotation and into strategy, then onto the board at 27, crossed the line that made the trade journals write about us again. A valuation north of $1 billion. The public infrastructure category I'd argued about with my grandfather over Christmas coffee at 22. Carol let me build that division. It is, as I record this, the second fastest growing book of business we have. The old man kept the article. Of course he kept the article. And in Naples, the music stopped. Not all at once. Fortunes that size don't vanish. They erode, and the erosion has a sequence as predictable as weather. The lawsuits from the dead development project ate first. The properties were leveraged because leverage had let the lifestyle continue without uncomfortable conversations. When the loans were called, the equity turned out to be mostly story. The jet share went, then the second boat, then quietly, the first. What remained, and there did remain something, my grandfather's instrument had been built generously, was a diminished, ordinary wealth, a comfortable life by any human standard. But Vanessa hadn't married a comfortable life. She had married the Hale inheritance, and she had now spent 8 years watching it be handed in front of her to the sister-in-law and the girl on the porch. She filed for divorce in March, 2 months after the second boat sold. I will not pretend to know what was said inside that marriage at the end. I only know the outcome, which was that she executed the exit with the same efficiency she'd executed the entrance. The lawyers were excellent, the timing was precise, and she walked away with close to half of what was left of the remains, the Naples house among it, which she sold within the year, my grandfather's sentence arriving on schedule. She'll be gone by then, because waking up is the one thing she was never going to stay for. My father called me that summer. I was 30. No, let me be exact. I was 28 and I was in my office, and his name lit up my phone, and the conversation that followed was the one I'd been bracing for since Bishop's conference room. He needed help. He said it straight, and I'll give him that because it must have cost him bridge money, he called it, a rough patch. The divorce had been brutal. The lawyers had taken everything the lawsuits hadn't. Here is what you need to know about the 2 years before that call. He had called before. Twice, while still married, money already smoking, but Vanessa still in the house. And both times I had said the same thing, a sentence I'd worked out with a therapist and could deliver levelly. Not while she's in your house, Dad. Not $1 that ends up in her hands. The day that changes, call me. The first time, he hung up on me. The second time, he was silent so long I thought the line had dropped. And then he said, "She told me you'd say that." The translator, still translating, and hung up softer. So when he called that summer, divorced, alone in a rented condo in Fort Myers, the question on the table was the one my grandfather had left me to answer alone. He never told me what to do about my father. I asked him once directly, "What do I owe him when it comes?" And he said, "That one's not a reed, Sarah. That one's a choice. Reeds are mine. Choices are yours." I flew to Florida. I didn't wire money. I flew because some conversations you owe a face. We sat on a rented balcony, and my father looked smaller than the math of years could explain, and we talked for 4 hours. The realest conversation we'd had since my mother was alive. He didn't perform, and there was no one left to perform for. Somewhere in the middle, he said the thing I'd waited 6 years to hear, and it wasn't an apology in the shape an apology usually takes. "I keep going back to that morning at Bishop's," he said. "Everybody watching me. And you know what I did? I looked at her. My own father takes the company out of my hands, and my first move is to check her face to see how I felt about it." He laughed, with nothing in it. He saw that. That's what the 10% was, wasn't it? He saw that years before I did. "Ask me again in 5 years," I said. He nodded for a long time. So yes, I helped my father. It started that summer, and it has rules. The way everything sound is built on rules. I cleared the genuine wreckage, the debts with teeth. There's a monthly number, boring and sufficient. He lives in a good condo he doesn't own, and he comes to Sunday dinners at Carol's, where he is, slowly, awkwardly, 6 years late, getting to know his own family again. The first time he and my grandfather sat at the same table afterward, nobody managed much. The third time, I came in from the kitchen and found the two of them arguing about the turkey like it was 2019, and I stood in the doorway and let it run. What I do not do is fund a comeback. He floated it once. One more development project. He still had contacts, just a small raise. I told him no the way Grandpa taught me to bid. A clean number, no apology, the reasons available on request but not volunteered. He took it better than I expected. The sleep, as my grandfather would say, was finally over. My grandfather is 82 now. He stepped back from the chairmanship last year. Carol holds it. I run strategy in the infrastructure division, and on the org chart, he doesn't exist at all anymore, which means, in practice, that he's the most powerful man in the building. He comes in on Thursdays. He wears the hard hat on site visits because regulations are regulations, and the crews treat him like the founding myth made flesh, which he hates and also, transparently, does not hate. A billion-dollar company run by his daughter and his granddaughter. Ask the trade journals, and that's the story. An unusual succession, brilliantly executed. A masterclass in transition planning. They still get him slightly wrong. It was never planning. It was reading. On the evening the new valuation came through, the billion, I drove to his house with a bottle of the bourbon Ruth used to buy him, and we sat in the back office where he'd once explained to me that concrete doesn't lie, steel doesn't lie, only people do. I asked him the question I'd been carrying since I was 22, the one from Bishop's conference room, now that the 5 years had run, and then some. What had he actually seen that Christmas Eve when a college senior with mud-free boots told the chairman his bidding posture was wrong? He thought about it properly. He always paid a question the respect of actually thinking. "I saw somebody nobody had managed yet," he said. "Your father agreed with everyone, so I never knew where he was. Vanessa performed for everyone, so I always knew exactly where she was, which is worse. But you," he pointed the glass at me, "you sat at my table on the worst night of your year, with the door still cold on your back, and you forgot to be hurt because the problem was interesting. A person whose curiosity outweighs their wounds, Sarah, will outbuild anybody on earth. I spent 50 years hiring for it. Found it at my own kitchen table at midnight." We drank to Ruth. We drank to my mother. He told the story about the 1989 foreman again, and I let him, because the day he stops telling it, I don't want to imagine. Here's where I leave you. People hear this story and think it's about money. Who got what percent? Who ended up with the boats? Who ended up with the building with the name on it? But run it back without the money and every event still happens. A woman decides an old man no longer needs charming because she believes the test is over. A son checks his wife's face to learn his own feelings. A girl gets a door shut on her and drives through the cold to a table where the places aren't counted. The money never made anyone in this story who they were. It just turned the lights on. My grandfather divided a fortune while he was alive because he refused to let the truth about his family arrive after he was gone. People called it eccentric. It was the sanest thing I've ever watched a person do. He gave each of us the same instrument, money, real money. And the instrument played each of us exactly as we were tuned. Carol built. My father slept. Vanessa left. And I got the life I have, which began the night a man who could read anyone looked across a ruined Christmas at the angriest girl in Ohio and placed his last bid. The lights on Mrs. Nobody's porch. I'm sorry, old habit. There's no Mrs. Nobody. Nobody, honey, it's nothing. That's what she called me. The woman at the door of my childhood home, 8 years ago, with 10 plates on the table behind her. She was wrong about almost everything, but she was wrong about that one first. Watch what people do when they think the test is over. And when somebody shows you who they are with the door, believe the door. Then go find the table where they never counted the chairs. There's always one. Mine had an overcooked turkey and a chairman drinking coffee. It was worth more than everything in that other house. It still is.